It was supposed to be a tranquil weekend getaway, a charming Airbnb nestled in the quiet outskirts of a forgotten small town surrounded by dense woods. I was drawn to it because of its seclusion and the promise of an escape from the constant buzz of city life. The host, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, had glowing reviews, and the house, from the photos, looked like something out of a fairy tale. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun cast long shadows over the woods, and the air was filled with the crisp scent of pine. The house was a quaint Victorian, its blue paint faded, but all the more enchanting. Mr. Thompson was waiting for me on the porch. "Welcome. I'm so glad you could make it," he greeted with a smile that was warm but carried a heaviness in his eyes. "I'll show you around quickly. Old houses like this can be a bit much to take in all at once." As he showed me through the house, I was charmed by its antique furnishings and the soft, ambient light filtering through lace curtains. However, as he concluded the tour, his parting words sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, and one last thing, my dear. Please stay out of the attic. It's not very safe. Floorboards are rotten." That night, after a light meal, I settled into the cozy living room with a book. The house creaked and settled, as old houses do, and I told myself there was nothing to be uneasy about. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake a pressing sense of dread. It felt like I wasn't alone. Around midnight, the house had grown eerily silent. Then a soft thumping sound echoed from above. Thump, thump, thump. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I froze, remembering Mr. Thompson's words. The attic. Curiosity overcame fear. I tiptoed to the attic door just to listen. But the moment I reached it, the thumping stopped. Hesitantly, I placed my hand on the knob, then thought better of it and turned back to bed. As I walked away, the thumping resumed, louder now, more urgent. I forced myself to sleep, but my dreams were plagued by visions of shadowy figures pacing the attic. The next morning, I felt silly for being scared. It was just an old house, after all. I decided to spend the day in town, exploring and forgetting the eerie night. Returning in the evening, I found the house just as I'd left it. Yet something felt off. The air felt stiffer, colder. I shrugged off the unease, attributing it to the falling temperature outside. After dinner, I settled in bed, determined to get a good night's sleep. But again, at midnight, the thumping started. This time it was accompanied by a dragging sound, like heavy furniture being moved. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to see what was in the attic. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept to the attic door. The noises grew louder as I approached. Heart pounding, I slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open. The attic was suffused with the pale glow of moonlight streaming through a small window. And there, in the center of the room, was an old chest. The thumping had stopped. The room was silent except for my heavy breathing. I approached the chest, the wood cold and slightly damp under my fingertips. I opened it, and inside, I found old photographs and letters, all addressed to a Lucille. As I shuffled through the papers, a cold breeze whisked past me and the door slammed shut. I spun around, flashlight darting across the room. "Who's there?" I stammered, voice barely a whisper. No answer, just the soft, sinister whisper of the wind. Or was it a whisper? "Lucille," it seemed to say. I turned back to the chest, and my flashlight flickered over one particularly disturbing photo, a black and white picture of a woman, her face scratched out, eyes that I could still feel on me. The letters were from Mr. Thompson, full of anger and despair. The last letter was an apology for something terrible he had done, something he wished he could undo. I had to leave. I packed my things, heart still racing, and fled to my car. As I started the engine, I saw Mr. Thompson in the rearview mirror, standing in the attic window, watching me. His expression was one of sorrow and fear, as if warning me not to dig deeper. Driving away, I called the police. They searched the house later and found a hidden room behind the attic. It contained personal belongings of several missing persons from over the years. Mr. Thompson was arrested, but even as they took him away, he only said one thing. "I tried to keep her happy. I tried to keep them all happy, but Lucille, she never stops." As for me, I never stayed in another Airbnb again, haunted forever by the memory of that attic and the ghostly whisper of a name, Lucille. I had always believed in the adage, "Don't judge a book by its cover," until I booked an Airbnb that seemed perfect. nestled on the cliffs overlooking the sea in a remote part of Scotland. The listing was sparse with details, but the view was breathtaking. What wasn't shown, and what I would only discover too late, was that some places keep their secrets hidden beneath a beautiful veneer. The drive to the cliffside retreat was long and fraught with narrow, winding roads. As I approached, the house stood as a lone sentinel against the backdrop of a churning gray sea. It was a modern structure of glass and steel, stark against the rugged cliffs. The host, a man named Malcolm, greeted me with a nod and a faint smile. He seemed as rugged and windswept as the landscape. "Cell service is a bit dodgy out here," Malcolm said as he handed me the keys, his Scottish accent thick. "Landline in the kitchen if you need it. Emergency numbers are by the phone. Enjoy your stay." His brisk departure left me feeling oddly unsettled as I watched his truck disappear down the track. The first night passed peacefully enough. I was lulled to sleep by the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs. But I awoke in the dead of night to a bizarre silence. The sea seemed to have stopped its relentless noise. Peering out the window, I saw nothing but a blanket of fog pressing against the glass, the sea invisible beyond it. As I tried to go back to sleep, the faintest sound caught my attention. Whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I strained to listen, I realized the voices were too coherent, too urgent. "Don't look out the window." A woman's voice hissed so close I spun around expecting to see someone in the room with me. But I was alone, or so it seemed. The whispers continued, a cacophony of warnings, each voice overlapping the next. I covered my ears, trying to block them out, but they seemed to echo inside my head. In a panic, I ran to the phone in the kitchen. I lifted the receiver only to hear more whispers, not the dial tone I desperately needed. That morning, I ventured outside, hoping the daylight would dispel the horrors of the night. Fog still blanketed everything, damp and cold, muffling the world into silence. I could barely see past a few feet, but I felt drawn to the edge of the cliff. As I approached, the whispers returned. "Turn back," they murmured just as the fog briefly thinned, revealing the tumultuous waves far below, beating against jagged rocks. I staggered back, heart pounding, realizing how close I had come to the edge, how close to oblivion. I decided to leave, despite having paid for a week. The place felt wrong, haunted by voices that wouldn't cease their dire warnings. Packing my bags, I noticed a drawer slightly ajar in the bedroom. Inside, I found a journal, worn and water-stained. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I flipped it open. The entries were written by a woman named Elsie, dated back to the 1980s. She spoke of the beauty of the house, the sea, and her love for Malcolm. But as the entries went on, the tone darkened. She wrote of voices in the fog, of Malcolm's strange absences, and her growing fear of the cliffs. Her final entry was a frantic plea. "If you are reading this, leave. The whispers, they tell the truth." I dropped the journal as if it were on fire and left the house, not bothering to lock the door. As I got into my car, the fog began to lift, and I could see the sea again, wild and untamed. I drove away, never looking back. Later, at a small inn in a nearby town, I mentioned the Airbnb and Malcolm. The innkeeper's face went pale. "That place, are you sure it was Malcolm who rented it to you?" I nodded, and she sighed, a look of sorrow crossing her features. "Malcolm was the original owner, but he's been dead for over 10 years, died by falling off the cliffs. They say he still lingers, trying to keep others away, or maybe to draw them to join him. That house has been empty ever since. No one dares go near it anymore." As I left the inn, her words echoed in my mind, mingling with the whispers that still seemed to linger at the edge of my hearing. I realized then that I had escaped more than just a house. I had escaped a trap set by the land itself, or perhaps by its lingering ghosts. That experience changed me. I no longer trust serene facades, nor do I ignore the whispered warnings that sometimes drift through the wind. And I never, ever ignore the past that might lurk beneath the places in which we seek refuge. I needed a break, a real breakaway from the city's incessant clamor and the suffocating routine of my 9-to-5 job. So when I stumbled upon an Airbnb rental tucked away in a small, seemingly quaint village upstate, it seemed like the perfect escape. The house was an old colonial, isolated at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by dense forest. The pictures promised peace and solitude. I booked a weekend there without hesitation. The host, who only went by AJ, online was brief in communications, giving me just enough information to find the house and let myself in. There were no neighbors in sight, just rows of tall, silent trees that swayed gently in the October wind. The house itself was more dilapidated than the photos suggested, its once white paint peeling to reveal the weary wood beneath. The moment I stepped inside, a faint, musty smell greeted me, a mix of old wood, dampness, and something I couldn't quite place. I chalked it up to the house's age and decided it was nothing a little airing out wouldn't fix. I opened a few windows and unpacked my things. That first evening passed quietly, the only sound the creaking of the house as it seemed to settle around me like a sigh. As darkness fell, the isolation I had craved during the day felt heavier, more oppressive. Shadows stretched long across the floors, and the wind began to howl through the trees outside, a mournful, wailing chorus that set my nerves on edge. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing hour. I kept glancing up, expecting to see someone or something peering in through the windows, but there was only darkness. Finally, I decided to head to bed, thinking sleep would offer some respite. I barely dozed off when a loud thud upstairs jolted me awake. Heart pounding, I lay still, listening. It was probably just the house settling, I told myself. But then it came again, a thud, followed by a dragging sound, like furniture moving across the floorboards. I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought and hesitantly made my way upstairs. The noise had stopped, and as I reached the top, the silence was palpable. But there it was again, a sudden scrape, coming from the last door down the hall. With every ounce of courage I could muster, I approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. It was unlocked. I pushed it open, and the flashlight beam fell on a startling scene. The room was in complete disarray, furniture overturned, the wallpaper torn, and in the center of the chaos, a large trunk. Drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity, I approached the trunk. The lid was ajar. Inside, I found piles of old, yellowed newspapers. The headlines screamed of a series of unsolved disappearances in the area dating back decades. My hands trembled as I read, the flashlight's beam flickering. Suddenly, the house went cold. I could see my breath in the flashlight beam. Then, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing, and tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, screaming for help that I knew wouldn't come. The wind outside howled louder, as if mocking my plight. Exhausted and terrified, I eventually backed into the trunk, knocking over some of the papers. That's when I saw it, a newer article that was not like the others. It was a printout, and it featured a photo of the house. The headline read, "Local Legend, Haunted Airbnb Lures Unsuspecting Tourists." The article detailed accounts from previous renters who had fled the house, claiming it was haunted by the spirit of a man who had once lived there, suspected in the disappearances but never charged due to lack of evidence. He had vanished into the woods, never to be seen again, and was presumed dead. As I read, the temperature dropped further, and the room grew darker, the edges of my vision blurring. I felt a presence behind me, a pressure on my back like a hand pushing me forward. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the room, but there was nothing. When I turned back to the door, ready to hurl myself against it, it creaked open on its own. Not waiting to see what might be revealed next, I dashed out, down the stairs, and didn't stop until I was in my car, driving as fast as I could away from the house. I reported my experience to the police, but they seemed skeptical, noting that the owner, AJ, had vanished months ago, and the property had been considered abandoned. No new rentals should have been possible, they said, as the listing had been pulled from Airbnb. I never went back, and I never rented a remote Airbnb again. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees outside my city apartment, it sounds eerily like the whispers of that house, calling me back to the darkness I had barely escaped.